One human man, one quiet farm, then 4 orc girls arrived, begging to stay. Rain came down in black sheets over the valley, swallowing the fences, the fields, and the last light around Elias's lonely farm. He was barring the barn doors when he heard it. Hoofbeats, shouting, then a sharp cry cut short in the trees, lantern shaking in his hand. He followed the sound to the edge of his wheat field and stopped cold. 4 orc women stood there in the storm, towering and soaked, their cloaks torn, their breath ragged. One clutched a bleeding shoulder, another could barely remain upright. They looked like warriors, but tonight they looked hunted. The tallest stepped forward, pride still burning through pain. "We need shelter," she said, voice low and strained. "Only until dawn." Before Elias could answer, torchlight flickered through the forest behind them, and suddenly his quiet farm no longer felt like his own. Elias's world had been small for so long that he no longer thought of it as lonely. It was simply his life, a failing farm at the edge of the borderlands, a crooked house with a patched roof, 2 tired fields that gave more stones than grain, and a silence so constant it had become part of his breathing. He rose before dawn, hauled water with stiff hands, mended broken tools instead of replacing them, and spoke only when work required it. In the nearby village, people knew his face, but not his heart. He was the quiet man with dirt on his boots and weather in his skin, the one who sold eggs, kept his head down, and returned home before dark. No one expected much from Elias. After enough years, he had learned not to expect much either. So when he found 4 orc women standing at the edge of his field in the storm, it felt less like strangers had arrived and more like another world had torn through his own. He should have turned them away. Any sensible human would have. Orcs were larger, stronger, feared across the borderlands, and rarely seen this far into human farmland unless something had already gone terribly wrong. But one glance at the wounded ones swaying in the rain, one look at the torchlights moving through the trees behind them, and Elias made the kind of choice that could ruin a life before a man had time to think it through. He led them first into the barn, hiding them behind hay and old harnesses while armed riders passed on the road. When the cold worsened and the wounded woman's breathing turned shallow, he brought them into the house. The place was too small for them in every possible way. Their shoulders nearly brushed the beams. Their boots left half the forest on his floor. His table looked built for children beside them. The fire, which had always seemed enough for one man, suddenly looked weak against 4 storm-beaten warriors. They did not enter like guests. They entered like women who had once belonged to larger rooms and harsher worlds, and hated needing either warmth or mercy. The tallest of them gave her name as Raka. Elias did not believe it was her true one. Even injured, she held herself like command came naturally to her. The other 3 watched her without seeming to mean to, turning slightly when she spoke, waiting for her smallest signal, measuring danger through her eyes before trusting their own. Her cloak was torn and muddied, but the clasp on it was fine metalwork. The blade at her side, though nicked from use, was too well forged for a common traveller. One of the others nearly addressed her by some formal title before cutting herself. "Off," Elias noticed. He said nothing. Their first moments inside were all tension. Elias set broth on the table. None of them touched it until Raka did. He brought clean cloth and water for the wound, and the most suspicious of the women looked at him as if kindness itself were a trap. Perhaps in her world it usually was. Elias understood enough of fear to recognize it even when it wore tusks and armor. When he knelt to examine Raka's shoulder, she went still as stone, not trusting, enduring. He told her the cut needed cleaning. She told him not to speak to her like she was fragile. He answered quietly that bleeding people all looked the same to him in bad light. For the first time, one of the other women almost smiled. That surprised them all. As the night deepened, the farmhouse became something uneasy and impossible. A shelter shared by people whose worlds should never have touched. Elias watched the women huddle near his poor fire, proud even in exhaustion, and felt the danger of them in every board of the house. But he also saw something else beneath the mud, the silence, the strain. These were not ordinary fugitives, and whatever had chased them to his door was not finished. Morning came grey and hard, with rain still dripping from the roof and a cold mist hanging low over the fields. Elias stepped outside before sunrise, expecting to find the 4 orc women already gone. Instead, the yard was silent except for the chickens, and when he returned to the house, he found the wounded one burning with fever and the others fully armed, as if they had been awake all night waiting for betrayal. No one spoke at first. Elias set water on the fire, checked the bandage on the shoulder wound, and said the sick one could not travel, not if they wanted her alive by nightfall. One of the women snapped that they had not asked for his judgment. Elias, tired and damp and already carrying too much, answered that she was welcome to ignore him after the fever killed her friend. The room went still. Orc tempers felt larger than human ones, heavier somehow, but after a long moment Raka gave a curt nod. They would stay one more day. One day became several. The storm passed, but patrols still moved through the forest road, and strange riders were seen in the valley below. Elias never asked exactly who hunted them. The women never offered. Survival itself became enough to fill the hours. Elias milked the goat, checked traps, patched a leak above the window, and stretched his food farther than he had in months. The orc women slowly became part of the shape of the farmhouse, though nothing about them truly fit there. Their cloaks hung drying beside his old work coat. Their weapons leaned against his wall. Their presence turned his lonely home into something tense, living, and unpredictable. At first, the trust between them was thin as thread. The women watched everything Elias did. They noticed where he kept the kitchen knife, how often he stepped. Outside, whether he slept deeply or lightly, Elias watched them too. He saw how even in exhaustion they sat with their backs to the wall, how one always woke at the smallest noise, how they took turns keeping watch without ever discussing it aloud. They were not merely travelers. They were trained, disciplined, accustomed to danger, but danger looked different inside a poor farmhouse. Here, survival meant clean water, hot broth, changed dressings, dry blankets, and enough wood on the fire to keep fever from turning deadly. Elias knew these battles well. He cleaned wounds with steady hands. He crushed herbs into bitter paste. He boiled old linen and tore it into strips. He gave up his own bed to the sickest of them and slept in a chair near the hearth, waking whenever the fire died low. The first night he did this, the most suspicious woman stared at him for a long time, and finally asked what price he meant to name later. Elias looked at her, too exhausted even for anger. "No one has ever paid me for kindness," he said. "I wouldn't know how to ask." That answer unsettled them more than anything else he had said. Little things began to shift after that. Not trust exactly, but a loosening of the air. One afternoon, Elias returned from the shed to find one of the women awkwardly trying to split firewood with far too much force, burying the axe in the chopping block so deep she could not pull it free. Another was crouched beside the chickens, offended by how boldly they pecked at her boots. For the first time since they had arrived, the house held something close to laughter. Brief, rough, quickly buried, but real. That night brought the first true softening. The feverish woman woke thrashing from sleep, disoriented and half-blind with panic. She thought enemies had found them. By the time Elias reached her, she had already knocked over a chair and nearly drawn a blade. He caught her wrist on instinct, then immediately loosened his grip when he saw the terror in her face. He did not shout. He did not order. He just kept his voice low and steady, as though calming a frightened horse in a storm. "You're safe," he murmured. "You're inside. No one's here. Breathe first, then look." The woman's shaking eased by inches. Around them the others stood ready, tense and ashamed to have been helpless before fear. Raka watched Elias with an unreadable expression as he set the blanket back over the sick woman's shoulders and made sure her water was within reach. He did not linger after. He simply returned to the hearth and sat down as if tenderness required no witness. Much later, when the room had gone quiet and even the floorboards seemed asleep, Elias drifted off at the table with his head bent awkwardly over his folded arms. In the dim firelight, Raka crossed the room, lifted her own dry cloak and folded it beneath his head so the edge of the table would not cut into his neck. She moved with the silence of someone used to being unseen when it mattered. He never woke. The next day, the distance between them had changed, though no one named it. Elias showed them how to mend a loose hinge with scraps instead of new iron. One of the women showed him how to set a spear brace against a door so it would hold under a charge. Another corrected the way he held a knife for skinning. They traded skills the way wary animals might trade space at the same stream, carefully, without admitting need. By the fourth evening, Elias had begun to see the shape of them beyond the fear. These women were proud, yes, and dangerous, but they were also exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with wounds. He noticed how Raka always waited until the others had eaten before taking her own portion. He noticed the moments when her face went still and far away, as if grief stood just behind her eyes. He noticed how the others watched her not merely as a companion, but as someone who carried more than her own life. While changing the dressing on her shoulder by firelight, Elias finally asked, "How does someone like you end up running through my fields in the dark?" Raka held his gaze for a long moment. "Someone like me." He tied the bandage gently. "Someone used to being obeyed." For the first time, her expression cracked into something softer than suspicion. "Even the mighty fall," she said quietly. Elias gave the knot one last careful pull. "Then maybe they should rest where no one expects them to be mighty." She said nothing after that, but she looked at him differently. The shift might have remained fragile and wordless a little longer, if not for dawn the next morning. Elias stepped outside to feed the animals and found a mark carved into the fence post near the lane. Not random damage, not weather. A symbol, sharp and deliberate, cut deep into the wood, an orc sign. He did not understand its meaning, only its intent. Someone had come close enough in the night to leave a message. When he turned toward the house, Raka was already standing in the doorway, fully awake, one hand resting on the hilt of her blade. Someone was still hunting them. The carved mark on the fence changed the shape of everything. Until that morning, the farmhouse had felt like a stolen pause in the world, a fragile hidden place where wounds could close, fires could stay lit, and danger might forget to knock for one more night. But the symbol cut into the wood told them the truth. Someone had found the edge of Elias's life and touched it with a blade. The 4 orc women saw it immediately. None of them asked what it meant. They did not need to. The most suspicious of them went for her weapon at once. Another began scanning the tree line with the stillness of a hunting cat. Raka said nothing for several breaths, but Elias saw the fury that flashed across her face before she buried it again. She knew the mark. That was enough. From then on, the days grew tighter, more watchful. Elias reinforced shutters that had never needed reinforcing before. He moved sacks of grain to conceal a narrow root cellar entrance beneath the kitchen floor. He showed them the old drainage trench behind the goat pen, half filled with reeds and hidden from the road. The orc women, in turn, stopped treating his farm like an accidental refuge and began studying it like ground they might have to defend. Suddenly, every gate, window, and tree line mattered. The change should have made the house colder. Instead, strangely, it drew them closer. Danger stripped away some of the useless distance. There was less room now for pride without purpose. Elias saw more of them in motion, who gave orders, who obeyed them first, who argued only in private, who stood nearest to Raka without thinking. Their bond was not friendship alone. It was loyalty built from something older and sharper. He could not name the shape of it yet, but he felt it more each day, and they were beginning to feel him too. The wounded one, whose fever had finally broken, sat with Elias while he repaired a cracked harness strap and asked, in a blunt, almost accusing tone, why a man would choose to live so far from everyone. Elias gave the easy answer first. The land was cheap, the village close enough, the quiet preferable to noise. She looked at him as if she had no patience for half-truths. After a long silence, he admitted the rest. Some places stop asking things of a man once they decide what he is worth. He had grown used to that. He did not tell the full story all at once, but the shape of it emerged in fragments over the next days. A sick mother he had cared for until the end, debts left behind, a woman he had once hoped to marry who chose a steadier life with someone else before poverty could pull her under too. A village that respected labor more than loneliness, and so never noticed when he became more useful than loved. None of it had made him bitter in the loud way. It had made him quiet, cautious with hope, skilled at enduring. The orc women listened, without interruption. In their world, pain was often worn like armor or shouted like challenge. Elias's was different. Buried deep, worked into the hands, folded into routine. That unsettled them. It affected Raka most. She began appearing beside him during work that did not require her. She would stand at the fence while he fixed it, or carry water from the pump with the others, and somehow stay behind after the rest had gone inside. At first, their conversations were sparse. She would ask practical questions. Why humans stored roots this way, why he tied herbs upside down, why he rotated the goats between patches of grass. Elias answered simply, amused, despite himself, that a woman who clearly knew battle and command knew so little about ordinary survival. Then the questions deepened. She asked whether humans always spoke so softly when angry. He asked whether orcs always spoke so harshly when worried. She asked why he never demanded answers from her. He said because people told the truth faster when they were not cornered. He asked why she ate last, even when she was hurt. She answered after a long pause that leaders in her world were watched most closely when food was scarce. That word stayed with him. Leaders, not warriors, not travelers, not outcasts. Leaders. It was not a confession, but it was a crack in the wall. At night, after the others slept, they started talking by the fire in the kind of silence that belongs only to two people who have stopped performing strength for everyone else. The flame softened her face, the shadows deepened his. Sometimes they spoke of practical things, the weather turning, the patrols on the road, the stores running low. Sometimes they drifted closer to truths neither had meant to offer. Raka told him without names that power was often lonelier than weakness, that those who bowed before you did not always see you, that being needed could become its own prison if no one ever asked whether you were tired. Elias said he understood more of that than she might think. He had spent years being depended on by land, animals, neighbors, and memory, yet somehow remained a man no one truly chose. She looked at him then, with a stillness that felt almost dangerous. Not because it threatened him, because it saw too much. The closeness between them grew through moments too small for anyone outside the house to understand. She noticed he always gave the least burned piece of bread to whoever looked most worn. He noticed she never slept fully, only lightly, as if her body had forgotten how to trust walls. Once, when he came in, soaked from bringing in a stubborn goat before a storm, he found a dry towel already waiting near the fire. No one admitted leaving it there. Another evening, he reached for a heavy grain sack at the same moment she did, and for a second their hands closed over the same rough fabric. Both drew back too quickly. Neither spoke, but the air changed. The others noticed. Of course they did. One of the women grew less suspicious of Elias and more suspicious of what silence was building between him and Raka. Another seemed quietly relieved by it, as though she had not seen that expression on her leader's face in a very long time. The wounded one, recovering fastest now, watched them both with a sad sort of understanding, the kind only carried by someone who had once learned too late what tenderness cost. Outside the farmhouse, the world kept tightening. The village had begun to whisper. Elias heard it when he went to trade eggs and salt for lamp oil. Just men at the smithy fell quiet when he passed. A woman he had known since childhood asked, too casually, whether he had seen strange tracks near his fields. Another muttered that border trouble always spilled downhill onto decent people. Elias answered carefully, but he was never a good liar, and suspicion followed him all the way home. By then, it was not only the village pressing in. The orc women were restless too. One argued they could not keep endangering him. Another argued they could not move yet, not with patrols growing bolder and Raka still healing. Their disagreement made something else obvious to Elias. Even when they challenged her, they challenged upward. Their loyalty was threaded through rank. That truth became impossible to ignore one bitter evening near sunset. A sharp wind had come, down from the hills, and Elias was outside with Raka securing the animal pens before dark. She had insisted she was strong enough to help. Halfway through fastening the last gate, her injured shoulder gave beneath the strain. Elias saw the pain hit her before she could hide it. She staggered once. He reached her before pride could make her fall. For one suspended breath, the world seemed to hold still. She was taller, stronger, built for battle and command. He was only a farmhand in worn boots with calloused hands, and no standing in any world but his own. Yet there she was, leaning into him just enough to stay upright, and there he was, holding her as if neither of them had any reason to be ashamed of need. Her breath caught. So did his. When she pulled away, she did it slowly, not like someone escaping touch, but like someone leaving warmth she had no right to keep. Then, in a low, formal voice, unlike any she had used with him before, she thanked him. The words were in her own tongue. Elias did not understand them, but he felt their weight. That night he lay awake longer than usual, and sometime past midnight the knock came. Not a pounding at the front door, not a clumsy intrusion. A deliberate signal, 3 measured strikes against the barn wall. Every woman in the house was on, her feet in an instant. Elias grabbed the iron poker from beside the hearth and followed them into the cold dark. They moved as one, silent and deadly, with Raka at the center of their formation. In the barn doorway stood a lone figure in travel-stained armor, head bowed, hands visible. An orc messenger. The moment he saw Raka, he dropped to one knee. Not in relief, in allegiance. And before anyone could stop him, he spoke her true title into the night. The word hit Elias like a blade drawn cleanly across old scars. He did not know the language, but he knew reverence when he heard it. He knew shock in the faces of the other women. He knew instantly that the person standing in his yard was not merely a fugitive under a false name. She was someone great enough to kneel to, someone powerful enough to bring a storm to his door. Raka dismissed the messenger quickly, voice cold, controlled, absolute. But the damage was done. When she turned toward Elias, the barn seemed smaller than ever, the silence sharper. He looked at her, not at the wound, not at the exhaustion, not at the woman who had sat by his fire and let him see pieces of her in the dark, but at the truth she had kept hidden inside his house. The firelight from the open door reached only halfway across the straw. Between them, the rest was shadow, And for the first time since the 4 orc women entered his farm, Elias felt something colder than fear. He felt betrayed. The silence after the messenger left felt louder than battle. For a long moment, no one moved inside. The barn. Wind pushed at the half-open door. Rainwater dripped from the beams. Somewhere in the dark, a horse stamped against wet earth. Elias stood with the iron poker still in his hand, though he no longer remembered picking it up. Across from him, the woman he had known as Raka held herself perfectly still, as if sheer control might keep the truth from spreading any further between them. But it was already there. It was in the bowed head of the messenger. In the fear and loyalty on the other women's faces. In the title Elias had not understood with his mind, but had understood instantly with his bones. She was not merely a hunted warrior. She was someone people knelt to. Elias looked from her to the others. "Who are you?" No one answered at first. One of the women shifted like she meant to speak, but a single glance from Raka silenced her. That, more than anything, broke whatever fragile patience Elias had left. "No," he said, voice rougher than usual, louder than he liked. "No more of that. Not in my house. Not on my land." The words landed hard because they were true. For days he had given them shelter, food, fire, his bed, his trust. Poor things, perhaps, compared to whatever world they came from, but all he had to give. And all that time, the center of it had been a lie carefully held between careful hands. Raka took one step toward him. "Elias!" He stepped back. The motion struck her harder than if he had shouted. At last she spoke, and when she did, the false name fell away. Her real name was longer, older, sharpened by history and blood. She was the daughter of a ruling clan line. More than that, the chosen heir after the death of an elder brother, commander of sworn blades, bound by blood right and duty to people, who would kill and kneel in the same hour. The 3 women with her were not friends traveling under bad luck. They were sworn retainers, highborn guards, women tied to her fate by oath and rank. They had fled after betrayal inside their own clan, a faction that wanted her dead, or alive only long enough to force her into a marriage, a surrender, or a claim they could control, had turned on her household. Loyalists had been slaughtered. Safe roads had vanished. Names had become weapons. So she buried hers and ran. Every answer explained something. Every answer made it worse. Elias listened without interrupting, but the hurt in him deepened with every word. The fine clasp on her cloak, the discipline of the others, the way they watched her before acting, the strange restraint in her speech. He had seen all of it. He had known there was more. But suspicion was not the same as hearing it from her own mouth and realizing that danger had not merely passed through his fields by accident. It had slept under his roof, eaten from his bowls, bled on his floorboards. "You should have told." "Me," he said. Her voice was low. "Telling you would have put a target on you the moment you knew." He gave a bitter laugh with no joy in it. "And hiding it did what? Spare me?" Her silence answered badly. The other women withdrew without being told, as if they knew this pain no longer belonged to rank. It belonged to 2 people standing on opposite sides of a truth that had arrived too late. "I opened my door to strangers," Elias said. "I thought that was the danger. But you—" He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "You stood in my home. Let me tend your wound. Let me think I was helping someone who had simply fallen into my life by misfortune. All this time you knew your world could swallow mine whole." "It already was swallowing it," she said, and the control in her voice cracked for the first time. "That is why I hid it." He stared at her. In the house, by the fire, in the long, quiet nights, he had begun to believe that whatever stood between them was simple in the only way that mattered. Not easy, never easy, but honest in feeling, if not in words. Now he saw the shape of the gap between them again. Status, power, bloodline, command. He was a poor human farmer with a failing roof. She was the kind of woman men crossed borders to hunt and kneel before. Old wounds opened inside him with humiliating speed. Of course she had seemed above him, even in ruin. Of course the woman who unsettled his heart belonged to a world where his name meant nothing. Of course the brief, strange warmth growing between them had always rested on ground he could not stand on for long. "You made me feel seen," he said quietly, the words dragging out of somewhere deeper than anger. "And now I find out even that belonged to a world where I never had a place." The pain on her face was immediate and real, not defensive, not proud, wounded. "That is not true." "Then what is true?" he asked. She took another step, slower this time, as if approaching. A frightened animal she had no right to soothe. "The truth is that when I came here, I intended to stay alive, nothing more. I did not tell you my name because names have power where I come from, and anyone who carried mine became part of the war around it. I thought if dawn came, I would leave, and your life would remain untouched." Her voice softened, grew more dangerous in its honesty. "Then you gave us fire, food, rest. You looked at me and did not see title first. For a few days in this small house, I was not what everyone needed me to be." She breathed once, steadying herself. "I did not expect to care whether you saw me kindly. I care now." He wanted that confession to heal something. Instead, it hurt more, because he believed her. Before he could answer, the first horn sounded from the far ridge. All heads turned. A second later came the barking of dogs, the distant thunder of hooves, and then, fainter but unmistakable, the crack of a signal flare somewhere beyond the tree line. The enemy had not lost them. The messenger had either been followed, betrayed them without speaking, or arrived too late to matter. The barn exploded into motion. One of the women was already pulling the hidden packs from beneath the hay. Another shoved open the side hatch to scan the slope beyond the fields. The third cursed under her breath and began issuing clipped reports in Orcish. Raka changed in an instant. The weary woman from the hearth vanished. In her place stood Command, cold-backed, alert, terrible in her focus. Elias hated how much it hurt to see how naturally the world rose around her. Torchlights were moving fast now at the edge of the orchard. Too many to be villagers, too disciplined to be thieves. Horses crashed through wet brush. Someone shouted in a language Elias did not know. Another horn answered. His farm, which had spent years being overlooked by everyone, had suddenly become the center of something vast and violent. Into the cellar. One of the women snapped at him. Elias did not move. Raka faced him, sword in hand, her shoulder wound half forgotten beneath urgency. "Go!" He looked at the blade, at the command in her posture, at the life that had stepped into his fields and changed everything. "That is easy for people like you, isn't it?" he said, voice breaking at the edges despite his effort. "To arrive with a storm behind you and call it protection when you tell other people to disappear." Her expression tightened like the words had struck flesh. Outside, something hit the far fence hard enough to splinter wood. The goats screamed, chickens burst into noise. A torch arced through the rain and landed near the shed, fire climbing fast where old straw had gathered. Too dry beneath the eaves. The sanctuary was over. One of her sworn women shouted that riders were coming around the south field. Another reported archers near the lane. They were being surrounded. Raka took one step toward Elias, torn between him and the battle with a violence no sword could show. Her duty was calling from every side. Her people needed orders. Her enemies wanted blood. And there he stood in the middle of it all, not as a soldier or servant, but as the one person who had known her in weakness and now saw what she truly was. For the first time since he had met her, Elias saw hesitation in her, not because she did not know how to fight, because she did not know how to leave him. The roof of the shed caught fully, sparks whirling upward into the black rain. Steel rang as one of the women met the first attacker near the yard, and with the farm beginning to burn around them, the fragile bond between Elias and the orc woman he had sheltered broke open at last. Not into safety, not into surrender, but into the raw, unforgiving truth of what it would cost for either of them to matter to the other. The night split wide around them. By the time the first side wall of the shed collapsed in a rush of sparks, Elias was already moving, not away from the danger, not toward the cellar where any sensible man would have hidden, but straight into the chaos of his own farm, with smoke in his throat and fear pounding hard beneath his ribs. He did not move like a warrior. He moved like a man who knew every inch of this ground better than anyone alive. That knowledge became its own kind of weapon. He shouted over the noise, pointing one of the orc women toward the drainage trench behind, the goat pen, telling another which gate stuck in wet weather, warning them where the ground dipped soft enough to trap a charging horse. The fields, the fences, the tool sheds, the root cellar, the stacked winter wood, everything that had once seemed like proof of his small life now became the map by which they could survive. Attackers broke through the orchard line. They were not villagers, not common raiders. They moved with purpose, some in dark clan armor, some in hired leathers, all converging with the confidence of people sent after something worth more than mercy. Elias saw one of the orc women meet the first, ride her head on and drag him from the saddle with brutal precision. He saw another drive 2 men back from the barn doors. He saw saw her fully now, stripped of false name and hiding, step into Firelight with her blade drawn and become everything her enemies feared. She was terrifying, and still, somehow, he only saw the woman who had sat by his hearth in silence and let him bind her wounds. "Elias!" one of the women shouted as another torch landed near the chicken coop. He ran for the water barrel, heaved a bucket, and cursed when half of it splashed uselessly into mud. The flames were moving fast. He made a choice in that instant. Not heroic, not noble, simply necessary. He cut open the animal pen and drove the goats loose into the lower field, chickens scattered wild into the dark. It meant chaos, lost stock, maybe ruin later if there was any later at all. But keeping them penned now would only roast them alive. His farm was already slipping out of his hands. He felt the loss and kept moving. Near the lane, one of the attackers tried to circle wide and reach the house from behind. Elias grabbed the long-handled grain flail, leaning against the wall, and struck not the man, but the horse's bridle, sending the animal rearing sideways into the fence. The rider crashed down hard, and before he could rise, one of Raka's sworn women was on him. For a brief, savage stretch of moments the defense held, then a horn sounded from the ridge again. More riders. Too many. One of the women shouted that they would be overrun if they stayed. Another yelled that the northern path was not yet blocked. They had a narrow way out, but only if they took it now. Raka stood in the center of the yard, issuing orders with iron certainty, yet Elias could see the fracture underneath. Every command pulled her farther from him and deeper into the life he had just learned was truly hers. When she turned and found him through the smoke, there was something almost desperate in her gaze. "Come with us," she said. It was not the major offer. Yet, not fully. This was the battlefield truth of it, the raw first shape. "Come with us, or be left behind in the ashes." Elias stared at her, chest heaving, soot on his face, the roar of burning wood behind him. "To what?" he shot back. "To your war? Your clan? Your world where every man will look at me and see—" Something dragged in from the mud. Raka crossed the yard in 3 strides. Around them, steel rang. A body fell near the gate. Sparks climbed into the rain-black sky. But inside that circle of firelight and smoke, her voice came low and clear. "To the place where I can stop asking you to survive alone." The words hit him harder than the battle. Then she said the rest, not as commander, not as heir, but as a woman making herself vulnerable in the one way that truly cost her. She told him that if they lived through the night, she did not want him, hidden in the background of her life, nor tucked away as some rescued human curiosity. She wanted him beside her openly, as her chosen one, her equal in the only way that mattered, whether her people approved or not. She would give him her protection, her household, land if he wanted it, a place in her future no one would be allowed to diminish. If the path demanded marriage by clan law, then marriage. If it demanded public claiming before warriors and elders, then that too. It was not a romantic whisper. It was a vow shaped like a challenge to the world. One of the sworn women looked at her in shock. Another turned sharply as if to protest, but stopped when she saw Raka's face. This was no impulse of battle, no passing heat. The truth of it had been building long before tonight. Elias felt the earth tilt under him. Some buried part of him had wanted to hear those words. Another part recoiled from them with equal force, because love offered by a woman like her was not a soft thing. It was enormous, public, dangerous. It came bound to class, to custom, to every cruel voice in his own head that had spent years telling him men like him were not chosen, only endured. "You don't know what you're asking." He said. "I do," she answered. "No." He shook his head, almost angry now because fear had nowhere else to go. "You can stand before your people and speak, and they will have to hear you. I walk in beside you and I become a lesson, an insult, a weakness your enemies use. A human, man from a broken farm, something they'll tolerate because you command it, not because I belong there." Her expression changed. Not softened, deepened. Then for the first time in front of her own sworn women, she reached for him, not to pull him, not to own him, to choose him where others could see. "They may call you weak," she said, voice carrying over wind and fire, "because they do not understand what strength looks like when it does not wear armor. Let them learn. You gave shelter when fear would have been easier. You gave care without bargaining. You stood your ground when truth hurt you. You are not lesser in my eyes, Elias. If you come with me, you come as the man I chose." That silence afterward felt impossible, carved out of smoke and steel and disbelief. Then the outside world crashed back in. A rival voice from beyond the gate shouted something in Orcish that made one of the women curse aloud. A challenger had arrived, someone of rank, someone expecting to drag Raka back into the shape of power she was supposed to obey. The insult came clear even to Elias through tone alone. Human, small, unworthy. There it was, the world speaking, exactly as he had feared. Raka did not even turn toward the voice at first. She was still looking at Elias, waiting, offering him the dignity of decision instead of dragging him behind her title. That mattered more than any promise. Around them, his farm groaned and crackled. The shed was gone. The fence along the south field had collapsed. The house roof had caught at one corner despite the rain. Even if the attack ended now, the life he had known was finished. The poor, careful world he had built from loneliness and routine could not be put back together board by board. He felt grief for it then, sharp, real, unsentimental. He also felt the truth beneath it. He had spent years calling that life peace because it was easier than calling it emptiness. One of the sworn women cried out. She had taken a cut to the thigh, but was still standing, still fighting. Elias looked at her, at the burning house, at Raka with ash on her cheek and promise in her mouth, and understood that there was no path left that did not cost him everything. So he chose the path that cost him everything for a reason. His voice shook, but it did not fail. "I won't come because you can protect me," Raka's breath caught. "I'll come," he said, "if I stand beside you as myself, afraid, human, unwanted by half your world, and still not hidden." Something fierce and aching moved across her face. "Then beside me," she said, "not behind, Not beneath, beside. The decision had barely left his mouth before the rival force surged again. Raka turned at last, blade lifting. This time, when the insult came from the gate, she answered in a voice that rang across the yard like iron striking iron. She named Elias before them all, claimed him before friend and enemy alike, not as property, as chosen truth. The cost was immediate: shock, rage, the fracture of old expectations. She was setting custom on fire as surely as the attackers had set the shed ablaze. But she did not take the words back. Together they broke for the northern path, the sworn. Women closing around them in a moving wall of steel and blood. Elias looked back once as they crossed the lower field. His farm stood in smoke and flame beneath the storm, the one place that had held his loneliness for years, now burning away. Behind him, he mourned it and kept going, because for the first time in his life he was not walking into the dark alone. Dawn found them far from the farm, in the cold blue hush between forest and mountain road, where the smoke of Elias's old life still stained the horizon behind them. No one spoke of turning back. There was nothing to return to that had not been broken, burned, or exposed. The farm that had once protected him with its obscurity had become the price of choosing something larger than survival. They had all paid. One of the sworn orc women rode with her leg bound tightly, pale with blood loss, but alive. Another had lost a blade she had carried since girlhood. The youngest of the four, the one who had once looked at Elias as if kindness were a trick, now watched him in silence with something close to respect, and Raka, no longer hidden behind a false name, no longer allowed the fragile luxury of being no one, rode at the center of them all, with ash still dark on her skin. Her wound reopened, and her back as straight as if the night had taken nothing. But it had. It had taken secrecy, distance, the illusion that either of them could step back into the person they had been before that storm. Their enemies did not vanish in a single night, but the attack on the farm changed the balance of the conflict. Word spread quickly through the borderlands and into the clan roads. The rival faction had struck too openly, too recklessly, spilling blood on human land and exposing the desperation beneath their claim. Loyalists who had hesitated before now had reason to move. Messengers rode. Old oaths were called in. By the time Raka reached one of her hidden strongholds days later, the struggle for power was no longer a hunt in shadows. It had become a reckoning. And Elias walked straight into it. The stronghold was everything his farm had not been: vast stone halls, high torchlit ceilings, guards with polished armor, voices that carried command without asking permission. More than once he felt every inch of his humanity there in the most painful way. He was smaller, quieter, plainly dressed, and unmistakably out of place. Some stared. Some openly disapproved. Others looked at him with curiosity sharp enough to wound. The first days were harder than the fire had been, because battle required action, but belonging required endurance. And still, Raka never hid him. That became the hinge of everything. When elders questioned his place, she answered in open counsel. When warriors muttered that a human man could not stand near clan blood without diminishing it, she asked which of them had crossed a border wounded, nameless, and near death, and still survived, because a poor stranger had shown more honor than half the powerful people around them. When custom pressed down like stone, she pressed back harder, not with softness, with certainty. Elias, for his part, did not try to become something he was not. He did not swagger through their halls pretending at warrior pride. He did not shrink into gratitude either. Instead, he did what he had always done. He worked. He noticed what others overlooked. He helped organize winter stores in a place built for war, but careless with hunger. He calmed frightened horses that did not know his language, but knew his hands. He repaired what was broken before anyone had to ask. Slowly, stubbornly, he became impossible to dismiss. Not because he became mighty in the orc way, because he remained fully himself and still proved useful, steady, and brave. That changed some hearts, not all. Earned endings are not clean endings. There were still whispers, still insult, still the cold reality that love across such difference would always cost them more than easier unions did. Raka gave up political simplicity the moment she chose him openly. Elias gave up the safety of obscurity. Neither walked away untouched, but both gained what had once seemed impossible. He was no longer a man needed only for labor and forgotten by nightfall. She was no longer a woman seen only through title, fear, and expectation. Between them grew something steadier than romance alone, a life built by repeated choosing, in public, in private, in peace, and under pressure. Months later, when the worst of the conflict had settled and her claim stood secure, Raka took Elias back to the borderlands. Not to the ashes themselves at first, but to the land beyond them. The fields were scarred, the old fence posts were blackened, the barn was gone, and the house had fallen inward where the roof had given way. Elias stood quietly for a long time, looking at what remained of the life he had once thought would contain all his days. There was grief in him. There always would be. Poverty had shaped that place. So had loneliness, but so had kindness, so had the first strange beginnings of belonging. Raka came to stand beside him, not speaking until he was ready. Then she placed something in his hand. It was the iron key from his old farmhouse door, found in the ruins by one of her people, and cleaned of soot. Bent a little by heat, but still whole. Elias stared at it, and for a moment he was back in that rain-dark night, hearing desperate voices at the edge of his field, feeling his own life tilt open. "We can build elsewhere," she said softly. "Or here." He looked at her. "Here. If you wish it." Her gaze moved over the broken land, calm and sure. A place with wider doors, stronger beams, enough room for your quiet and "My storms." The word struck him so deeply he almost laughed, almost broke, almost did both. So they built. Not a grand fortress, not a peasant hut either. A border home of wood and stone, shaped by both hands and both worlds. Orc-crafted beams, human-made hearth, a doorway tall enough that no one had to bow their head to enter, and a table built broad and sturdy enough for every body that belonged. Around it. The first meal they ate there was simple broth and coarse bread, and when Elias set the bowl before her, she looked at him with the same unreadable softness she had worn by his fire the first time. Only now there was no false name between them, no need to leave by dawn. When the night wind rose beyond the fields, it no longer sounded like emptiness pressing at the walls. It sounded like distance traveled, like danger survived, like the world-making room at last for something it had never expected to keep. And as Elias stood in the doorway of the home they had made from ruin, with Raka beside him and lamplight warm behind them, he understood the truth that had taken him years. Fire and loss to earn. The quiet farm had not been the end of his life. It had been the door,